You've smoked something today, even if you've never touched a cigarette in your life. Every breath near a barbecue, a bonfire, a candle blown out too close to your face, that's smoke entering your lungs, and somewhere in your brain, something takes notice. That reaction is at least 1,000,000 years old, and it might be one of the reasons your species survived long enough to invent civilization in the first place. So here's the real question, and it is not the one you think. It's not, is smoking bad for you? Everyone already knows the answer to that one. The real question is this: why does smoke, from a fire, from a plant, from anything, feel significant to a human brain the instant it hits? Why do we have receptors sitting inside our own skulls that seem to be waiting for it? Stay with me, because the answer starts long before Homo sapiens existed. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why a Bronze Age temple in the Kingdom of Judah, a shaman's tomb in the Andes, and a cigarette in your grandfather's hand are all somehow telling the exact same story. Here's the myth almost every video on this topic repeats. Smoking started with tobacco. Tobacco started with Columbus. Before 1492, nobody on Earth was inhaling anything on purpose. That myth is not just wrong, it's wrong in almost every direction at once. And the reason it's wrong is that smoking is actually 3 completely different stories tangled into one word, and archaeologists have only recently learned how to pull them apart. The first story is accidental. Roughly 1,000,000 years ago, at Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, our ancestors, and this is important, these weren't even Homo sapiens yet. This was Homo erectus, smaller brain, heavier brow, learned to keep a fire burning inside a sheltered space, night after night. From that point forward, every human and pre-human ancestor who sat near a hearth breathed smoke. Constantly. Unavoidably. Chemical analysis of fossilized teeth from Kesem Cave dated to around 400,000 years ago, and from Neanderthal remains at El Cedron in Spain, dated to roughly 49,000 years ago, both show smoke residue baked directly into the dental tartar. Your ancestors were inhaling smoke for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone ever chose to. But here's where it gets interesting. Burning plant matter doesn't just release carbon and water vapor. It releases a cocktail of alkaloids and other compounds, and some of those compounds are psychoactive. And it just so happens that the human brain contains something called the endocannabinoid system, receptors that regulate mood, memory, and appetite. Receptors that did not evolve because of cannabis, but that cannabis compounds happen to fit almost perfectly. So somewhere, at some point, completely by accident, one of your ancestors sat downwind of the wrong plant on the fire and felt something shift. Their brain wasn't confused. It recognized the signal. That accident, repeated enough times across enough generations, might be the true starting point of everything that follows. Archaeologists are very careful here, though, and you should be too. Ash and charred bone alone don't prove intent. A fire being controlled doesn't mean the smoke was being sought out. For a very long time, this stayed accidental. So when did it stop being an accident? This is where most documentaries just guess. We don't have to. In 2021, a team led by archaeologist Darren Duke published findings in the journal Nature Human Behavior from a site in the Great Salt Lake Desert of Utah called Wishbone. Inside a hearth dated to roughly 12,300 years ago, buried alongside duck bones and stone tools, they found 4 charred seeds of wild tobacco. Not scattered by wind. Concentrated in a spot where that plant didn't even grow naturally. Someone carried it there. That pushed the earliest confirmed human tobacco use back by 9,000 years in a single paper. And it likely wasn't smoked at all. The researchers believe it was chewed. Around the same broad window, in Italy, at a submerged Neolithic village called La Marmota on Lake Bracciano, and later at a cave in Spain called Cueva de los Murciélagos, archaeologists have directly radiocarbon dated charred opium poppy capsules to as far back as 5500 BCE. 2 completely different continents, 2 completely different plants, chewing and eating rather than smoking, but the same underlying behavior. Humans seeking out a plant specifically because of what it does to the mind. This is the second story. Deliberate use, but not yet smoke. Now for the third story, the one people actually mean when they say smoking. And the oldest solid chemical proof of it doesn't come from where you'd expect. In Alabama, at a site called Flint River, researchers ran mass spectrometry on a small stone tube and confirmed nicotine residue baked into the material, dated to roughly 3,600 years ago. Let that sink in. Deliberate tobacco smoking in North America, proven with modern lab chemistry, predates the pyramids of Giza's most famous dynasties finishing construction by only a few centuries, and predates any contact with Europe by 3,000 years. Halfway across the world, high in the Pamir Mountains of western China, at a site called the Jirzankal Cemetery, researchers recovered 10 wooden braziers from 8 separate tombs. This is the site some documentaries garble the name of, calling it the Pamir Mountains. But the real location and the real science is even better than the myth. Published in the journal Science Advances in 2019, the analysis found cannabinol, the chemical fingerprint left behind when THC breaks down, on 9 of those braziers, at levels far higher than wild cannabis would naturally produce. Someone, roughly 2,500 years ago, was selectively burning high-potency cannabis in an enclosed mortuary ritual, specifically to generate smoke. And this is exactly what a Greek historian described happening a continent away and got mocked for it for 2,000 years. Herodotus, writing around 430 BCE, described a nomadic people called the Scythians, building small tents, heating stones inside them, throwing hemp seed on those stones, and, in his words, howling with pleasure at the vapor. Historians assumed he was exaggerating. Then, archaeologists excavated Scythian burial mounds at a site called Pamir in Siberia and found the exact setup Herodotus described: a fur pouch of cannabis seed, a censer, and the folding frame of an actual inhalation tent. He wasn't exaggerating. If anything, he underplayed it. One correction worth making here, because it gets repeated constantly online. You may have heard about solid gold Scythian bongs. Those were real objects found in a looted burial mound in the Caucasus, and they did test positive for opium and cannabis residue, but they show no scorch marks. Archaeologists now believe they were drinking vessels for a psychoactive brew, not bongs for smoking. Close, but not quite the story you were told. Here's the part that should stop you cold, though. All of this so far has been personal, or ritual, or medicinal. At a site called Tel Arad, archaeologists found something that changes the entire category. Tel Arad was a fortress guarding the southern border of the ancient kingdom of Judah, and inside its shrine stood 2 limestone altars dated to around 750 BCE. In 2020, a reanalysis of material that had actually been dug up decades earlier, tested independently at 2 separate laboratories, found that the smaller altar had been loaded with cannabis mixed with animal dung, a mixture specifically designed to burn at a lower temperature so the smoke could be inhaled rather than simply destroyed. The larger altar held frankincense. This was not a shaman's private tent. This was not a nomad's burial gift. This was a state-sanctioned institutional temple, and its official religious ritual appears to have involved deliberately producing psychoactive smoke as part of formal worship. The lead researcher on that study said plainly that it was the first time cannabis had ever been identified anywhere in the ancient Near East. If you think that's wild, hold on, because in 2025, a team led by Stanford archaeologist John Rick published something even stranger from the site of Chavín de Huántar in Peru. Deep inside sealed underground stone galleries, they found 23 tubes carved from bird bone, camelid bone, and deer bone, essentially ancient snuff straws. Chemical testing confirmed nicotine from wild tobacco on several of them, and, remarkably, DMT and bufotenine, the same family of compounds found in ayahuasca, from a plant called vilca, dated to between roughly 800 and 350 BCE. But here's the detail that actually matters. These chambers weren't communal. They were small, private, and could only hold a handful of people at a time. The researchers now believe this wasn't about a whole community sharing a spiritual experience together. It was the opposite. A small elite controlling access to an altered state of consciousness and using that control to justify their authority over everyone else. Getting high, in other words, may have been one of the earliest tools of political power. 1,000 years later, and 1,000 miles south, in the high Bolivian Andes, archaeologists found a shaman's ritual bundle wrapped in leather, containing carved snuff tablets dated to around 1000 CE. Chemical analysis found traces of cocaine, DMT, bufotenine, and harmine, at least 3, possibly 5 distinct psychoactive substances in a single kit. None of those plants grew anywhere near where the bundle was buried, which means someone, 1,000 years ago, was either traveling enormous distances or trading through extensive networks specifically to assemble a personal pharmacy of altered states. Now let's go back to Egypt, because there's a discovery here from 2024 that even most archaeology channels haven't covered yet. Everyone already half knows about the Ebers Papyrus, ancient Egyptian instructions from around 1550 BCE for treating lung conditions by inhaling smoke from heated herbs, medicine you deliver directly to the lungs, the same basic logic behind a modern asthma inhaler. But in 2024, researchers using synchrotron imaging, DNA analysis, and chemical residue testing examined a small ceramic drinking mug shaped like the head of the dwarf god Bes, a protector of households and childbirth, dated to the Ptolemaic period. Inside, they found a cocktail, Syrian rue, a plant whose alkaloids are known to trigger vivid, dreamlike visions, blue Egyptian water lily, a fermented wine-like base, honey, and, mixed directly into the drink, biological residue consistent with human blood, breast milk, and other bodily fluids, deliberately added. Researchers now connect this vessel to fertility rituals and dream incubation ceremonies tied to an actual Egyptian myth in which the god Bes calms a furious goddess with a blood-colored drugged drink. This wasn't just medicine. This was theater, mythology, and pharmacology fused into a single object you could hold in one hand. Let's come back across the Atlantic, because tobacco's story in the Americas deserves more nuance than Columbus discovered it. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, his own journal describes local people walking around with small burning bundles of leaves, inhaling and exhaling the smoke. His crew was baffled. His crew also tried it within weeks. Of course they did. But among native nations, tobacco was never a casual habit. The calumet, what's often called the peace pipe, wasn't really about the bowl at all. It was the decorated stem that carried the meaning, and presenting one could stop a war in progress. Jesuit missionaries in the 1670s documented indigenous leaders using the calumet to seal treaties and alliances between rival nations. In the eastern woodlands, tobacco was often blended with sumac, bearberry, and dogwood bark into a mixture called kinnikinick. Among the Lakota, tradition holds that the sacred pipe itself was a gift from white buffalo calf woman. This was diplomacy, law, and religion, delivered through smoke, with protocols far more disciplined than having a cigarette. And it wasn't only smoked. Recent chemical analysis of tiny Maya flask vessels found nicotine residue directly inside them. And on one particular flask, archaeologists found something almost eerie. A painted Maya hieroglyphic label that translates to, roughly, the home of his tobacco. The ancient label and the modern lab result matched. The Maya smoked tobacco rolled in reeds and corn husks, closer to a cigar than a pipe, and also drank it, snuffed it, and used it in ways that would surprise most modern audiences entirely. Here's a fact that should really rewrite the popular story, though. Pipe smoking, specifically the water pipe, may not have started with contact between Europe and the Americas at all. At Wonderwerk Cave in Ethiopia, archaeologists recovered 2 ceramic water pipe bowls, radiocarbon dated to roughly 1320 CE, and chemically confirmed to have held burned cannabis. That predates any confirmed European tobacco contact with Africa. Related finds, a possible bone pipe from Botswana and clay pipes from Zambia, suggest sub-Saharan Africa may have independently developed pipe and water pipe smoking entirely on its own. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, Aboriginal Australians were doing something different again. A plant called Pituri, heated in sand, mixed with alkaline wood ash to release its active compounds, then chewed rather than smoked, sometimes containing nicotine levels several times higher than a modern cigarette. It was so valuable, it was traded along routes stretching across the entire continent for thousands of years, functioning almost like a currency. Chewing, not smoking, but exactly the same underlying human behavior, showing up independently again and again on every inhabited continent. Here's where modern science is pushing the story even further. In 2018, researchers discovered that nicotine can survive inside ancient dental plaque, the hardened calculus stuck to fossil teeth, letting archaeologists identify individual tobacco users, by name essentially, by age, by sex, thousands of years after they died. In 2025, a study on skeletal remains from coastal Chile found nicotine's breakdown product in the teeth of 7 out of 12 individuals, dated to roughly 6,000 years ago, with no pipes, no paraphernalia anywhere nearby. Which means the true timeline for psychoactive plant use is almost certainly still being rewritten, one tooth at a time, in labs right now. So here's the real answer to the question in the title. When did ancient humans start smoking? There isn't one date. There are at least 3. Roughly 1 million years ago, smoke started entering human lungs by accident, every single night, around every single fire. Somewhere between 12,000 and 5,000 years ago, across completely disconnected continents, humans started deliberately seeking out psychoactive plants, chewing them, eating them, not yet smoking them. And somewhere in the last 3,500 years, in Alabama, in the Pamir Mountains, in the deserts of Palestine, that behavior became smoke on purpose, woven into medicine, religion, diplomacy, and in at least one Bronze Age temple, actual state power. But that doesn't mean everything associated with fire or smoke throughout history was beneficial or should be imitated today. Many of those practices were rooted in ancient rituals and cultures, and they don't reflect what we now know about the health risks of psychoactive substances. If you liked going this deep into how far back human behavior actually goes, I've got another video that does the exact same thing for an even harder question. How did ancient humans survive an actual ice age with no walls, no heating, and temperatures that would kill you in hours? It's right there on your screen. Go watch that one next.